Hello and welcome to season 11, episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop, and I sound like I'm in a giant tin can.
That's true. You're very echoey today.
I was just saying before we get started, I'm in your younger brother Jonah's bedroom to try to get the best signal, and he has a white ceiling, and so I have this set up so I'm looking down upon you.
As you always do, for some reason, do you tilt your like laptop back so that the camera is specifically pointing upwards every time? You're like looking down at me.
Well, now I feel like I'm angelic. I have a bright white T-shirt, which is actually a T-shirt I got at that conference that you
Oh,
went to.
nice. Yeah, the Houston Christian Conference. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great.
and and I have the ceiling light right above my head. So if I tilt my head,
It's
it's like
just a bright
it's like
white light.
so with a white ceiling and the pretty light colored walls and this light right over my head. Uh, I'm starting to figure out maybe I tried to go on an 8 mile run today. I got 5 miles into it. I'm like, I'm done. I just quit. I hadn't done that in a long time. Like, this is cold. It wasn't rainy, but it's a little sprinkly.
Hmm.
And I was at West City Park, so I was doing the paved asphalt trail loop, and I thought, well, I already compromised. I'm supposed
Hmm.
to do 8. And I thought, well, I'll do 7.
Hmm.
I'll do 10 laps around the asphalt loop, which is basically like 0.7 miles. And anyway, and so now I'm starting to think maybe I died. Maybe this, maybe I'm broadcasting. Well, this is actually pretty encouraging because that would mean I'm broadcasting from heaven.
There you go.
Echo. At least it's not flames and torture. Maybe that's what the listener gets to experience.
On that happy note, um, we are of course reading J.R.R. Tolkien's *The Monsters and the Critics* and Other Essays, a collection of his scholarly work. And this time we're talking about the essay on translating Beowulf. Now this one was very technical. I wasn't sure what your takeaways were from this one, especially towards the end. I know there's a lot of discussion of meter that probably isn't worth us sort of describing, because that's something you'd probably have to read directly from him to kind of understand what he's talking about. But there was a lot of good stuff, I thought, in specifically the first section, talking about how you translate different words and sort of the meaning you have to get across there.
Yes, I agree on all points, but I would like for you to, I did read the on
Hmm.
meter. I'm not sure why I did. But maybe you can give like when we get to that point, maybe a couple sentence
Yeah.
explanation of what his general point is.
Hmm.
Um, but I think I kind of have
Right.
ideas,
Right.
especially the introduction to it. Anyway.
Hmm.
So I don't know again, I kind of at a loss of how you want to
Hmm.
discuss this. It's an essay, I guess. It's an essay. It seems like it's an essay that was written. I know I read like in the intro the intended audience was,
Yeah.
and was this in a. I don't know if this was. Anyway, it seems like it's a essay or a speech or some
Hmm.
presentation
It's a
to other
preface.
linguists. Yeah.
Yes, well, it was a preface to a translation of Beowulf.
Uh,
In the forward, it says it was contributed as prefatory remarks on prose translation of Beowulf to a new edition in 1940 by
mm,
Professor C.L. Wren of Beowulf and the Finnesburg Fragment, a translation into modern English prose. So this was specifically addressing, like, how do you go about translating this? It was at the beginning of this other volume by this other author that he worked with.
because that's what it seems like.
Yes.
Except for that it doesn't even seem like he's even attempting to communicate with a
Hmm.
non-expert or educated audience.
Yeah. Well, I think C.L. Wren was also the person he worked with for his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the
Mm.
Middle English poem there. So it's his name will come up again. But I think, yeah, if you're kind of creating a Beowulf translation, unless it's specifically targeted towards like a popular audience, especially at the time he's writing, right, 1940, you don't have too many like non-academic types who are like, yeah, I just want to sit down and read a translation of Beowulf. So I think it is pretty academic in nature, and kind of assuming you know a little bit about what Beowulf is, not just something you'd sort of pick up off the bookstore shelf and read on a whim.
That is correct.
All right.
So, how do you want to discuss it? You want to summarize his thoughts, or you want me to try to summarize his thoughts? I can
I
take a
mean,
stab stab at it.
Yeah, I mean, I could just kind of.
But I do have. I wrote a question.
Oh, sure.
Oh yes, I took notes. Uh, I can't remember if you had told us. Have you read the original
No,
Beowulf?
no,
Okay.
I can't read Old English. I have it in my online shopping cart to purchase at some point in the future from anybook.com of the Old English of Beowulf. But no, I haven't read it. I can't read Old English. I can kind of, from what little I know, parse pieces apart and you rely on some basic knowledge. But no, I can't read it directly. I want to. It's on the
You're
list
so in a way you're illiterate.
in terms of Old English. Yes.
Correct.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate that. Um, it's
If
great.
we are invaded by a bunch of aliens that only speak Old English
Yes,
and only
that'd be
provide
very unusual.
English, well, maybe they made contact with us in that era, and now they're
Mm,
coming back, and they're
they-
like, they don't understand us.
yeah,
I would
that'd be a
expect that
problem.
in translators, kind of like Star Trek
Yes,
or like Google Translate. I guess if you do interplanetary travel,
yeah,
you probably have a universal translator program, don't you think?
probably. Yeah. Thank you for those enlightening remarks here.
Well, that's it's kind of linguistic.
It is. It is. This essay would be very helpful for aliens who want to know what the process is of translating Beowulf. But he mentions, sort of at the beginning, he says,
Accurately. Like, isn't he? I'm sorry, interruption. Go ahead. Go ahead.
no,
Go
no, no, go ahead. Whatever you want to say.
ahead. No, well, the essay is actually kind of interesting.
Yes, no, it's very interesting.
He's I like how he just starts it. He just says there no defense is usually offered for
Hmm.
translating Beowulf. And I'm like, wonder what context would it be required?
Yeah, yeah. Well, he goes on to say, it says too many people are willing to form and even to print opinions of this greatest of the surviving works of ancient English poetic art after reading only such a translation, or indeed after reading only a bare argument such as appears in the present book. So he's saying, if you want to know about the work, you should know what the process is that goes into it of translating it, right? You should kind of know what the underlying structure is if you're going to write a whole essay about it, if you're going to, form some scholarly opinion about it. You have to know what goes into it. If you just read it in translation, you're missing something, and you're especially missing something if you only read an argument, sort of a summary of the thing. You're missing even more, right? You kind of have to have some knowledge, even if you can't read Old English, to know sort of what the translator did to get to where he got his translation.
You know, when I was reading this, I was actually thinking, I don't know if I should say this. I was thinking of when I was a youngish prosecutor and jail calls
Hmm.
are recorded. And so, in a big enough case, while I'm kind of working on other stuff, I would listen to the jailhouse calls. Actually, we it really helps a lot of the prosecution because people get talkative.
Hmm.
But there was a whole language, a I don't know what you want to say. How do you want to say it? It's a whole, like the slang.
Hmm.
I'm not
Be like a
fluent. I'm
like a
not.
dialect.
Yeah, it is. It is, and code words, and then there's gang, the sub language and gang code and that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. And one of them was, an actual threat to kill a witness, and an admission on a murder. Um, so I mean, but anyway, but um, some of the advice he gives about translating Old English applies in principle to understanding different dialects. And
Oh
so
yeah.
it is really good universal advice and kind of what I kind of did a little intuitively or tried to do back when I'm trying to figure out what the hell are these people even saying to each other. It's funny after you listen to a few hours, you really start understanding.
Hmm.
It's like an immersive type thing. Like back then I didn't even know what. Probably didn't really know much about what a baby mama was,
Mm.
as opposed to something else. Play cousin was a new thing for me back in the day. You know what a play cousin is?
Uh-uh.
So if you kind of grow up in these blended families, you're like family,
Hmm.
but you're not actually related. So you
Mm.
can be next door neighbors, or you could be like it's basically like stepbrothers, but there's no marriage. So
Gotcha.
there's no bloodline at all. And so to clarify, well, who's Adam to you? Well, he's my cousin. I said, well, you have to ask him, well, is he your cousin or your play cousin? Oh, he's my play cousin.
Hmm.
Okay, so you're not really like it's his mom's not your aunt. No,
Right.
no, 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 no. He's my play cousin. So I
Hmm.
mean, there's
Right.
like there's a
Huh.
whole
Interesting.
vocabulary out there, and then once you know that, you can do like family diagrams
Hmm.
that include play cousins.
Hmm.
Because if we at the time I was trying to map out certain gang affiliations within this particular area, and it was very helpful, to get known associates and that kind of stuff. Anyway,
Yeah.
so
Oh, it's interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, it's very interesting.
you should
Um,
know what play cousins are. That's a known thing.
I guess I should.
Yes,
Um,
you do.
But yeah, no, he continues on because he's talking about, to use a prose translation for this purpose is nonetheless an abuse. Beowulf is not merely in verse, it is a great poem, and the plain fact that no attempt can be made to represent its meter. He goes on and talks about that. He says, really the purpose of a prose translation is as a study aid, right? You shouldn't really offer a prose translation as a substitute for the original thing. If it is this big poetic work, you should try and capture some of that unless you're using this prose translation specifically as a study aid, right? To sort of map the words more directly there. And he says, yeah, he goes on. I thought it was really good. I mean, it's really just a whole essay on the nature of translation as a whole, on how exactly you capture sort of the meaning of the original and how much of that can be lost in translation.
So what are your thoughts? He really obviously he loves Beowulf, and,
Yes.
and he describes it as the greatest of the surviving works of ancient English poetic
Hmm.
art. I don't know how much poetic art there is from
Right.
ancient English, the era,
Hmm.
but then he mentions I like this turn of phrase. One famous critic informed his public. I like how he says that his public that Beowulf was only small beer.
Hmm.
Beer at all, it is a drink dark and bitter, a solemn funeral ale with the taste of death. But this is an age of potted criticism. I think you read that. I think you
Hmm.
mentioned that pre-digested literary opinion.
Yeah.
So he really he's not like really insulting the guy, but he really kind of is.
Hmm.
He does it in a
Yeah.
very very erudite. Is that the right word?
Yes.
Way.
Yeah.
So I guess you would agree it's like a really important poetic art,
Oh,
at
absolutely.
least
Yeah.
known
It's
as that.
Yeah, it's definitely the most well known, most influential of all the old English literature, just period. I'm just trying to think of what other old English poems that I even know the titles of or sort of referenced as. I know there's another poet named Cynewulf, who was around. I don't even know what he wrote, but I know the name, and this is just showing my ignorance. But I mean, you also have, I guess, Bede was writing in Old English. He'd be kind of the biggest like other like literary rival, but he wasn't writing in verse. He was writing like the history of the English church in the 600s. I
Hmm.
think he was 600s. Maybe he's yeah 600s. I think is right. The Venerable Bede. But yeah, there's not a lot of really old English literature, period, that we still have. And Beowulf, out of all of it, is the most important.
Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome. But he goes on and talks about, yeah, and this whole first section, before he goes into the really more detailed sort of analytical section on meter, is about, how you translate specific words, and how Old English, you really can't get one-to-one meanings a lot of the times. He says, yeah, for many Old English poetical words, there are naturally no precise modern equivalents of the same scope and tone. They come down to us bearing echoes of ancient days beyond the shadowy borders of northern history. Yet the compactness of the original idiom, inevitably weakened even in prose by transference to our looser modern tongue, does not tolerate long explanatory phrases. For no study of the fragmentary Anglo-Saxon documents is translation a complete substitute. And so, yeah, so he's saying like, how do you actually convey the meaning of these words? How do you get that tone, right? Even if it means literally the same definition, you're missing something, right? No matter what, no matter how you translate something, you're missing something that's not present in the original.
What page were you quoting from?
That was from page 50,
Okay.
yeah, a little bit lower down in the page.
Yeah, and I would agree. Like when I was translating the jailhouse phone calls into my notes, it lost some of its flavor.
Did it?
Yes, some style.
It lost some of its poetry.
Mm. Yes.
Yeah, huh. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, there's a certain, you know,
A certain what?
je ne sais quoi. Is that the right
Yeah,
thing?
yeah, I don't know what. Yeah, I think that's the phrase you're looking for. I don't know if anyone's ever used that phrase in reference to jailhouse calls.
Oh, I'm a man of many
Yeah, so
talents.
you're a poet yourself for sure.
I've
Um,
often thought I should write poetry.
I don't doubt it. Um,
Too lazy to start. It's similar to my 8-mile run, which was 5 miles today.
Yeah, but he goes on to talk about he talks about one of the big things in Old English poetry. This is in 51. Is what he calls sort of the descriptive compounds. He says if they are seldom in fact unnatural, they are generally foreign to our present literary and linguistic habits. Their precise meaning and full significance for a contemporary is not always easy to define, and their translation is a problem for the translator over which he often must hesitate. So this is like an Old English poetic device called a kenning, right? Which is really just sort of a compound.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's a hyphenated word, right?
Essentially, but it's so
Two
common
words.
and it's so like fundamental to Old English poetry that it had its own name, right? And this is like one of the building blocks of the poetries. You come up with your own poetic compounds. He says some of them like make sense to us. He says a simple example is sund wudu, literally flood timber or swimming timber, right? That's a ship
Yeah,
with this compound here. But he says a lot of them aren't. He says another similar, simple one is Swanrod, which is Swan's Road, right? That's the ocean, the road for swans. He says, but the
huh.
bare solution C would lose too much, right? So it's like, how do you deal with all of these kennings? How do you deal with all these compounds, right? A Swan Road is literally the sea. Do you just put C, or do you translate literally the kenning? Do you put Swan Road, right? It works for that one. We can kind of understand what that means, but there's a lot of them that do not work. He says this is on 52.
And
He
you'd
says,
almost have to use that Swan Road and then like do a parenthetical or a comma,
mhm,
uh, and kind of define it or
right.
further explain it, which I guess would be cumbersome.
Right. I mean, it's a lot of footnotes. I mean, that's what you see in a lot of translations of everything. Like a lot of the books, back there on my shelf are translated, Latin or Greek or some of the originals. I mean, and you have like whole pages that are just footnote trying to explain what this means in the original and trying to convey, the meaning that's lost there. And it's like, well, that's not a very accessible way to translate something. And it's because you have a whole page of footnote trying to explain one compound word. And it's like, okay, how do you deal with all this? How do you convey what the original meant? And, he provides a couple examples. He said such cases, more difficult are such cases as onband beaderune in line 502, in case you're wondering, used of the sinister counsel or unferth, and rendered gave vent to secret thoughts of strife. And that's how the translator translated that phrase. He says literally it means unbound a battle rune or battle runes. What exactly is implied is not clear. The expression has an antique air, as if it had descended from an older time to our poet. A suggestion lingers of the spells by which men of wizardry could stir up storms in a clear sky. So yeah, if you translated that literally, unfair, unbound a battle rune, what does that mean? How do you convey that? And he says, you have some idea of this sort of magical, a mystical nature to that, but you don't really have that in the gave vent to secret thoughts of strife, which is how this translator did translate it. So it's like, okay, which one's better? Which one's the better translation? The purely literal, or do you try and convey the meaning? How do you get sort of the tone in there, which is so tricky in a lot of these phrases?
Yeah, and I like this where he has it on page 52 where he says, but familiarity with this manner does not come all at once in the early stages, as some of to whom this old verse now seems natural enough can doubtless well remember one's nose is ground close to the text, like studying it so hard. Both story and poetry may be hard to see for the words.
Hmm.
So I think that's what he's kind of getting at, what you described more technically, where he's saying, if you're really trying to study the word so hard, you lose the poetry
Right.
and even the meaning of the story
Hmm.
itself, or you're not adequately conveying what that is because you're so hung up on the technical translation of the words, or
Right.
like you said. pages of footnotes.
Right. And then that's kind of what I was talking about a lot, last episode too, right? It's with a lot of these linguists, a lot of these scholars, it's you're missing the whole poem for the words. It's like you might know very technically, very analytically where this word comes from, what exactly it means in this context, but if you can't really translate it into the whole concept of the poem, well, it's what good does that real analytical, nose to the page knowledge give you? What point is that if you can't really get the whole thing in context?
Mm-hmm. But then he goes on to say, maybe I'm skipping ahead from where
Hmm.
you want to be. Like on
No,
54,
sorry.
it says, a warning against colloquialism and false modernity has already been given by implication above. So he also says,
Mhm.
you shouldn't just, dump in a bunch of modern words willy-nilly. I don't think that he uses the term willy-nilly.
Yeah.
But I think that he also says you got to be careful not to just put in these a false translation to
Right.
modern English just to make it more accessible to the modern reader.
Right.
He goes
Yeah.
into detail about that.
Which reminds me, I'm gonna have to look this up really quick, because I'm forgetting. Oh no, I know exactly what it is now. It's come to me. But there's this translation of the Odyssey that was really praised, a real modern translation from Emily Wilson, and it was really praised because I think it was one of the first translations of the Odyssey done completely by like a woman. So it's this big sort of PR thing where it's like this is the greatest translation to ever exist, and I've read parts of it. I haven't read the whole thing, but it is not great. It is a
Mm,
very modern, like very weird colloquial, and that's what she was intending to do. It's like I want it to be very accessible to the modern reader. I want it to be sort of in this. There's sort of this modern notion that a lot of the ancient Greek like poetry, these epics, should be more conversational. That's sort of the modern approach now, because it's like they were sung at like popular events. They weren't just restricted to scholars and stuff, which is true, but it's still this massive poetic work. And clearly, they're using
yeah.
these great phrases. And the first line of the Odyssey, there's this great phrase. This is how Homer introduces Odysseus, and I'm forgetting exactly what the Greek means, but it literally means like a many-turned man, right? And it's referencing essentially his whole journey, right? And I know a lot of translations have used like a man of many turns, right? He's
Mm,
this complicated man, he's this sort of convoluted man, and his whole journey, he's bouncing back and forth all over the Mediterranean. This man of many turns. It sort of just encapsulates his character. And the way
mm,
Emily Wilson translates this, all this meaning packed into this one word. And the first line of her translation is "Tell me, O Muse, of a complicated man," and that's
mm,
it. And it's like you see that with a lot of these modern translations, where it's like we want it to be as accessible as possible, want to make it open as possible. You just lose so much.
yeah.
And it's just like so it's kind of sterile in some ways, but and I remember reading parts of her translation as well. You look at a lot of the dialogue, and that is like very colloquialized. It's like, hey man, what's going on here? And it's like it's like this just doesn't fit. We
Stop.
we know this doesn't fit. It doesn't make any sense. It's like there should be a tone that you use for translating, epic poetry. It's epic for a reason. It just
Yeah.
drives me crazy.
Well, that reminds me of the I think horrible musical Hamilton. I,
Yeah,
I'm
I
kind
do
of
not like it.
I'm still kind of wondering why. I guess I don't know why people like it, but as an aside, I saw a headline. I didn't read the story. There's a pool like billiards
Hmm.
championship somewhere, and they allow they have men and male and female uh, categories or whatever.
Sure.
But I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
But evidently, men are really a lot better at pool than women.
Hmm.
I don't. Maybe just the men are more experienced or something because that doesn't seem to make any sense to me.
Right. Yeah.
'Cause I don't know that you need anyway. But the championship game is between two dudes who are trans or whatever.
In the
They
women's,
and the women's the championship match. I think it's supposed to be scheduled today. Or
that's ridiculous.
there was two trans dudes.
That is
Uh,
ridiculous.
But I'm wondering, like, it's like on the one hand we celebrate, this women's translation, and I haven't read it, but I've read the headlines and I've read some criticisms of it. But um, it's wild to me that you can celebrate a woman's achievement like that,
Hmm.
but then you're like, wait a second, how are these how are the men now beating women in these different competitions? I mean, should we celebrate the women? I don't know.
Yeah.
But not to go down a whole other
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
I just thought it was funny. I had to
Yeah.
look it up.
Yeah.
I don't know who's going to win. I know it ain't gonna be a woman.
Oh,
Uh,
that's funny.
yeah, I don't know why, and I don't know why a woman. But I remember seeing some headlines about that particular translation.
Mhm.
And maybe it was at the bookstore or something. Like
Yeah.
that table, I think.
Yeah, she also did the Iliad a while back too. I mean, not to diss her too much, because I mean, translating a massive ancient Greek work like
Hard.
that, regardless, is
Yeah,
impressive. But I don't know
yeah,
why you would choose to do it in such a way, and I don't know why so much praise. I mean, I get the reasoning, but I think it's a bad decision.
yeah. I mean, I don't. I mean, I think it's a bad idea to do it that way. But if you're going to do it, okay. But but I remember seeing, like, oh, this woman did a translation. Well, of course, a woman could do a
Yeah.
translation. I mean, why is that was there some sort of deficiency that we weren't aware of? Why aren't we celebrating this? We should be at a point now, after all these years, where, like somebody says, "Oh, that's the first woman to do that." And you're like, "Oh, really? Huh? I thought that a woman would have already done that." It's kind of
Yeah.
it should be a curiosity,
Yeah.
like, "Oh, huh.
Hmm.
Well, I would have expected that a woman would have already translated the Odysseus and, the Iliad and all that." Okay.
Yeah.
And but I don't think that a woman should get praise for being a woman and doing a thing, that a man can do too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
I'm simplifying it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
back to where we were.
Yeah, no, I like that you brought up, because I was going to mention that too. I also like the page before that, where he's talking about, perhaps the most important function of any translation used by a student is to provide not a model for imitation, but an exercise for correction.
Yeah.
So it's not that, you have everything literally spelled out for you, but it's like when you're reading a translation, you should be considering, okay, why did the translator do this? You should be looking into the original yourself and figuring out if you could find any problems, if you would find a way to do this better.
Yeah.
And he says, if writing in one's own books is ever proper or useful, the emendation or refinement of a translation used in close comparison with a well-studied text is a good case for the use of a careful pencil. And I liked that because, he seems also kind of adverse to writing in books, and I very much am, right? You have to have a very good reason to write in a book, I think.
I have scribbles all over this thing.
Yeah, it's great.
Um,
Um,
yeah, it's shorthand. So I do have other notes.
oh,
Uh,
please.
uh, I've already asked them. Very
Very helpful notes.
already. Well, they were.
Yeah,
I've already done that.
yeah.
Did you know? I did notice on 54 that he talks about the use of particular words,
Hmm.
and so how they may not be able to be translated or others. And I was kind of struck by Beorn.
Hmm.
I was like, oh, that rings a bell.
Yes.
And
Yeah, because
and yeah,
he's mentioning, yeah, it's used to mean warrior, literally. Beorn and Freka. He says both meant warrior or in heroic poetry man, but literally Beorn was still a form of the word bear.
there,
And
yeah.
that word even has a really interesting history. I mean, it's still Björn in like Norwegian and Swedish and stuff like that, very similar. But we think now that like for a lot of the sort of northern Germanic people, bears were held to be like spiritual in some way, like they had some sort of spiritual significance. And so if you said its name, it would like summon a bear. And so the
Hmm.
word we have now is literally related to the word brown, right? If you kind of look at the word Beorn, brown, they come from the same root. So they think that by trying to avoid saying whatever their original word for bear was, they called it the brown one, and
Hmm.
that sort of became, or the brown thing, the brown animal, and that became the word for bear over time.
Like Voldemort,
What?
he whose name cannot be
Oh,
said.
right.
Voldemort, right? Harry Potter.
Yeah,
Why are
I
you looking at
thought.
me like I'm crazy?
No, I thought you were going for
Because you
because
summon him, right? You never mention Voldemort by name.
yes, that's right, that's right. I thought you were referring to because in Harry Potter, like the Lord Voldemort, that comes from like an anagram of the original dude's name, right?
Oh
It's
yeah.
like yeah, Tom Marvolo Riddle, I think, and it spells out I am Lord Voldemort if you yeah spell it out. I thought that's where you're going for. I was like, no, it's not
No.
the same thing.
Yeah. No. That I was just talking about. He who shall not be named.
Yes, no, I
Yeah,
understand.
yeah, and yeah. Okay. Very good. Moving along. We're going to go down a different path, but we don't need to do that.
Yeah, but I like what he says here on 55. He says, we're being at once wisely aware of our own frivolity and just to the solemn temper of the original if we avoid hitting and whacking and prefer striking and smiting talk and chat and prefer speech and discourse, exquisite and artistic and prefer the cunning craft and skill of ancient smiths, visitors suggesting umbrellas, afternoon tea, and all too familiar faces, and prefer guests with a truer note of real hospitality, long and arduous travel, and strange voices bearing unfamiliar news, well-bred, brilliant or polite noblemen, visions of snobbery columns in the press, and fat men on the Riviera, and prefer the worthy, brave, and courteous men of long ago. This
Yes.
is getting too like we should prefer sort of those words that sound archaic to us, and a lot of the reason is those are just Germanic words. A lot of those preferred options, and a lot of the ones on the left that he has in italics there, those are often, I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them are Latin words. Those are Romance words. Visitors, brilliant, I think polite as well, exquisite, artistic, for sure. But it's like we should be preferring those things that sound more true to the original. These sort of archaic words,
Yeah.
these the words that have more weight to us in some way. That should be what we should be considering in translating this old poetry.
Yeah, and he says it above that quote that you said. Where I really like where he puts it. He says, "There's nonetheless a case for it," meaning like using some of these older versions of the words. The development of a form of language familiar in meaning and yet freed from trivial associations and filled with the memory of good and evil is an achievement. I
Hmm.
just thought that was a
Yeah.
really good quote. It's like some of these older words and archaic words have a deeper meaning than just bad fat man.
Right.
I mean, yeah, you can you can describe it that way, or you can talk about it using different terms that are maybe you won't be able to. It seems like we dumb everything down to like a
Right.
third reading level in all our media and stories, and I think we're losing something over the long term with that. And I think people, it's just like me listen to jail calls. I can learn a different dialect without any sort of formal instruction if I'm just exposed to it enough.
Right.
And I think that's part of the problem with our communication now in America is that everything's dumbed down so much.
Hmm.
People lose the meaning and don't understand the language that was used even just 40 years ago.
Right. Well, I
You
think a
know.
big problem as well is just nobody teaches poetry at all anymore. Like I feel like it was mentioned a few times in grade school, and I hated it every time. Where it's like, "Oh, this is stupid. This is pointless. I don't know why we're learning about this." But I can't even think of
Yeah.
a time in high school where I was taught about meter and how I certainly wasn't taught about how meter works. But I'm even trying to think of any time we read anything written in verse.
Oh, I think
Uh,
you probably did because you would have done the haikus, like there's the basic stuff. And what's
that's
the other
true.
one? Iambic pentameter.
We didn't do that. We never learned that. I
Really?
didn't get that until undergrad in my Latin classes.
Huh.
When actually looking at the weight of different syllables and stuff like that is just completely absent. I think from a lot of modern like high school and grade school education, you just don't talk about poetry anymore, which I think is very unfortunate.
I'm not a big fan of poetry.
Yeah, I didn't used to be, but I didn't really know anything about it. Now I like reading poetry.
Yeah, I don't. I think it's because I'm lazy.
Hmm. I
Because
mean,
it's
it
like,
definitely requires more work. Like it's
yeah,
not something you just breeze through, right, on a casual, Sunday afternoon or something. It's like you have to sit there and be like, wow, I have to appreciate what this person is writing. I think that just ties into the dumbing down of everything.
yeah. I guess I'm just lazy like everybody else because I kind of just want to say, well, get to the point.
Yeah, yeah,
Why are you being so vague?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what a lot of people. I
Poetry.
think that's a lot of people's criticism.
I would think the like the good poems, really convey something. I mean, I think it's
Hmm.
really hard to clearly convey an image or an idea through poetry.
Yeah.
Um, I'm reading one of the books I'm currently plowing through is a book about the Crimean War,
Mm.
and there's a Tennyson that wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade. So I just got to the point where the Light Brigade charged in a nearly suicidal attack. But um, it's a neat little. I don't know. I think you'd call it a poem. I think it's
Yeah.
a poem. Yeah,
I mean, if it's in verse, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But it's neat, and you don't it's very descriptive of an event.
right.
But, Anyway,
But going back to the book, we were just talking about don't use too modern of words, but then he says don't fall into the opposite problem. Don't use a
yes.
word just because it's archaic, right? It still has to mean something to the modern audience. He says that the fact that a word was still used by Chaucer or by Shakespeare even later gives it no claim if it has in our time perished from literary use. Still less is translation of Beowulf a fitting occasion for the exhumation of dead words from Saxon or Norse graves. Antiquarian sentiment and philological knowingness are wholly out of place. And he provides the example to render Leoda, freemen, or people by Leeds, fails both to translate the Old English and to recall Leeds to life, right? It's just nobody's going to know Leeds as a word outside of a place name, in England, right? I would have no idea what Leeds meant if I just saw it, somewhere in a poem. My first guess would not be free men or people.
Yeah.
I would not think that. So it's like, well, you have to avoid that. That's a very different a problem there. And he says a very similar related problem is the etymological fallacy, right?
Yeah.
It's like we have certain words now that are very clearly derived. They evolved from an earlier word, but they might have a very different meaning, right? He gives the example of wan. Wan is not our modern term wan, but dark. Mode is not mood, but spirit or pride. Burg is not a borough, but a strong place. And ealdr is not an alderman, but a prince. So the vocabulary of Old English verse may have philological interests, but it had no philological objects, right? You can't just find whatever word derived from that original word and plant in its place because it might have acquired a very different meaning.
Hmm. Hmm. I don't know if I'm skipping ahead too far,
No,
but
no.
I really like this where he ends the section.
Hmm.
So maybe you can stop me if you want to, but I love this.
Well, I will say, but before you do
Yes,
that,
go ahead.
I think going back to that because he has this whole discussion of the Kennings, right? And I think I want to touch on those a little
We
bit.
already discussed the Kennings.
Well, we can discuss them again. There's lots to talk about. But he points out some more examples, right? Where it's like English is kind of rare in sort of the Germanic languages, especially Indo-European broadly, has a lot of compounds. It's Germanic languages very very easy to make compounds with, but even some of them don't make sense to us anymore. He says, the compound gleobane for the harp as gleebeam, right? That doesn't make any sense to us, or as mirthwood and similar. He says, it is plain that the translator dealing with these compounded words must hesitate between simply naming the thing denoted and resolving the combination into a phrase. And it kind of goes into the different, the choice between the evils that we mentioned earlier. But he says, yeah, kind of maybe this is going to what you were talking about, but sort of in that end of page 59, he says, I've called this the poetic class because there's a poetic intention in their making, referring to the kennings. But compounds of this kind are not confined to verse, not even those which are poetic and fanciful. We find kennings in ordinary language, though they have then, as a rule, become trite in the process of becoming familiar. They may be no longer analyzed, even when their form has not actually become obscured by wear. We need not be led astray in our valuation of the living compounds of poetry by such current kennings. And he goes on and talks about some of those. One of them was really interesting. The word Lord was originally a kenning, and I had no idea that this was the case. I forgot about it since last time I read this. Hlafweard, meaning bread keeper, hlaf, bread, weard, keeper, which is ward, where we get our modern day term ward, is seldom found in this clear form and usually appeared as hlafword, hence our wholly obscured Lord. So you have Hlafweard to Hlafword to Lord, having become among the English the ordinary word for lord or master. I thought it was really interesting that we still have these kennings like present in our everyday speech. We just don't even recognize them. Lord itself is a kenning. We can't even recognize, the component parts anymore, but originally was one of those.
Yes, it's fascinating.
Thank you. What did you want to mention?
Well, in the very end is
Mhm.
kind of his conclusion. He talks about, I'll just read it. And therein lies the unrecapturable magic of ancient English verse for those who have ears to hear, profound feeling, and poignant vision, filled with the beauty and mortality of the world, are aroused by brief phrases, light touches, and short words resounding like harp strings sharply plucked.
Yeah.
But if that's not an ode to a poet, I don't know
Hmm.
what is. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a poetic description of poetry. Plain
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
and he just has it in here, just kind of buried at the end of
Hmm.
this section talking about, translating Beowulf. I just thought it was brilliant.
Right. Yeah, and then the last half of the essay, which again we're not going to go into the detail on, is on meter.
Oh,
So this is
really?
just specifically.
You don't want to go through all the, he has like charts and stuff.
Yeah, specifically talking about like
A,
how,
B, C,
yeah,
and D,
yeah,
and end always in a monosyllable, syllabic dip in Old English. Yeah, you want to, okay, no,
not that much detail.
okay.
But yeah, I will just say, because it might be interesting to all of our many listeners who might be more familiar with other types of poetry. I think we kind of referenced this in the last episode as well, because he had a note on it. But the meter in Old English is very different than a lot of others, right? You're not sort of counting the feet to fit a pattern. It's, I think Tolkien, the phrase he uses is like masonry blocks, right? Where you're sort of stacking phrases on top of each other. And he says, really, the meter is two opposed word groups or halves, and there are six basic patterns. And so he kind of goes into the detail there of how exactly you weight the words and how exactly those patterns make. But it's really you're sort of having these two phrases that are sort of built up, as sort of couplets in a way, but not really. But it's sort of two sections of meter, and that's sort of how lines are placed. And I'll just read a little bit of how he sort of notes things in this translation on 63. It says, time passed away, on the tide floated, underbank their boat, and her bows mounted, brave men blithely. Breakers turning spurned the shingle, splendid armor they bore aboard, in her bosom piling well-forged weapons. Then away thrust her to voyage gladly, valiant timbered. She went then over wave tops, wind pursued her fleet, foam throated like a flying bird, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of hear it's not similar in many ways to a lot of those other, like iambic pentameter, which we're
Yeah.
much more used to with the da 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 da. But it's this sort of you do get that sense where it's sort of these bricks being laid. It's you have these pairs and it's this sort of thick, very dense
Mhm.
sort of meter. It's very, very much, I think he kind of references in that part of the essay. It's very much sort of in tune with the tone of the poem itself, of like
Yeah.
the subject matter of that sort of dense, that dark, where it's like even the meter is reflecting that, and it perfectly matches the language of Old English, and it sounds, I think, really interesting to us today, just being, sort of still having some of that grammar, some of that construction from Old English.
Agreed. It's kind of like a dirge or a dark story.
Yeah, yeah,
Set the tone just by the
yes,
emphasis in the words and
yes,
the words. Yeah,
exactly.
it's great.
All right. Well, do you have any other thoughts on this? Hopefully, you enjoyed reading it at least. I know this one was pretty technical.
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's different. It's kind of a window into your world in a
Mm,
way. You know,
yeah.
into your interests. So I would not have read it otherwise.
Oh, there you go. The next one is on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I don't know if you've ever read that or the last time you read that was, but very good Middle English poem rather than Old English now.
I started to watch a movie by
Hmm.
that name, and it was so bad I stopped like 10 minutes into it.
When was it made? Was it a recent one?
Yeah, I don't know. It was like
Yeah.
Amazon. It was free, and
Oh.
so I think it was maybe 80s or 90s or
Oh,
maybe
okay.
2000s or something.
I
I
know
don't
there
know.
was one that came out like just a few years back because it came out when I was in high school when we were reading Sir Gawain. It was like a horror movie based on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which seemed like it would be kind of ridiculous.
No, it wasn't. Well, I didn't really get too far into it, but it was set in like the old English
Okay,
countryside type thing.
gotcha.
Yeah, the Green Knight showed up and challenged the king or something, and then the other guy came in, and then
That is the story. Yeah.
and I was like,
Well, luckily you get to read a whole essay about it for
no,
next one.
I wasn't being critical of the
Yes.
story itself.
Yes. Yeah. The
It was a
movie. Yeah. Yeah.
weird production, and it seemed very put upon.
Hmm. I see. I
Yeah,
see. All right. Well, unless you have any other thoughts.
I have no thoughts.
All right. Well, this has been season 11, episode 2 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
Mark Bishop.
And you can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions.
.com.
Nope. Well,
Oh,
no, not .com. What?
.org.
Yeah, there you go.